Okay, hi. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi.
Would you like to introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so my name's Aaron. I am currently a software engineer with Google, which of course means I have to say the normal line of anything I say today is my own opinion and solely my own opinion and does not reflect the opinions of my current, past, or potentially future employers. Um, so yeah, I'm a software engineer, specifically a senior software engineer at Google, with a current focus in what is called code protection, which kind of falls underneath anti-reverse engineering, anti-hacking. It's definitely not a place I meant to get into, more so a place I fell into, um, which my younger self probably wouldn't have liked too much because I always was someone with that clear vision of what it was supposed to be after school. And I don't know if I'm even close to that anymore, which is always an interesting thing to think back upon.
Yeah,
In addition to that, I am an active member of Google's interviewing pipeline and student outreach.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool. Um, so I was looking at your LinkedIn profile and noticed that you had, it looked like quite a bit of experience in college and stuff before you even entered the workforce through just projects and then also some internships as well. Do you want to talk about how you got involved in those, what they were,
Sure.
and how they maybe helped your journey into full-time work?
Yeah. So the story all begins with a small company in Winnipeg. They're much larger now, called Complex Games. I was able to do an interesting summer internship back right after high school, where I was a paid intern for half of the week and an unpaid intern for the other half of the week. Uh, it was the only way that they could afford to have me on, and it was even a odd negotiation with my parents at the time to allow me to do it. And that came out of just a what I would almost call a stupid decision, which was one day I was bored and I realized I had the name of the president of the company and wondered if he was on Facebook. Found him on Facebook and sent him probably the most obnoxious message I could, saying, "Hey, I'm amazing. Can I please come meet y'all?" And from some grace and no understanding of why, I was welcome to come visit the office, and after a while getting to know them, was able to come be an intern for them one summer. And then for the 2 summers after that during college, I was able to return as a contractor for them, which got me a fair bit of experience with a lot more responsibility than I would ever give to myself when I think back of what my skill level was back then. And those 3 summers kind of paved the path to allow me to later in the next 2 years go to Capcom Vancouver as an intern, go to 343 Industries as an intern, and then later go to what is now called the Coalition, but was called Black Tusk Studios back then as an intern. And of course, the last 2 there were owned by Microsoft, but that whole story allowed me to catch the attention of a Google recruiter, which is how I ended up at Google. It was a bit of a change considering the 6 positions I held before Google were all in the games industry, and I'm fairly far away from the games industry these days.
Nice. So you mentioned Winnipeg, which tells some people that you aren't from the U.S., right?
No, I am a Canadian. I was a Canadian. I still am a Canadian, and I plan to continue being a Canadian. But yes, born and raised, and went to school in Canada. I went to school at the University of Manitoba, which is an okay school. Many people haven't heard of it, but in terms of Canada, it's a decent school. It's definitely no University of Toronto. Waterloo is probably the biggest name in terms of tech in Canada. University of British Columbia is also pretty renowned, but definitely when it came to coming out of Manitoba, I got to be a bit of a big fish in a small pond. I was the first student in at least 10 years, and we only know 10 years because no one was around before that, to get an internship with Microsoft. I was the first student straight out of college to get to go to Google. There have been people who have followed suit, but I got to be the one to be a first for many of those things, which was quite rewarding when you get to come from somewhere a bit smaller than where a lot of people I meet these days come from.
Yeah, I agree. With my university, I only know one other student in the 4 years surrounding me that interned at Microsoft, and I don't know anyone else from who interned at Google from my university in the recent future or past. So I'm just curious, did it make getting an internship harder? And if so, in what ways? And do you have any advice for other Canadian college students who are trying to get internships at Microsoft or Google or other large tech companies in the US?
Compared to the US, it's actually easier in Canada. In Canada, what's common now is there's a structure called the co-op program, which many universities participate in, where you do alternating academic, work term, and the schools are set up with career departments that are in regular communications with local and not beyond local employers. And so it used to be easier because the co-op programs were smaller. The departments were smaller. It's gone a little bit more competitive now. I know at the U of M, there's a lot more people wanting to come into the co-op program than there is space within the co-op program. So there's a bit more competition there. And so it's a little bit easier in Canada for that point, just because it's baked into the education system. It's not the same as it's summer, you're on your own. Maybe you have a career center that can help you with getting a resume or something. But at a lot of schools in Canada, there is a computer science specific career center. They are managing relationships with a lot of companies. They're the ones who are talking. There's usually a recruit, for example, with Google, we have recruiters who are assigned to specific schools who, if there's a co-op department there, they will be talking with the co-op coordinator there. So there will be a relationship between the school and the company on a person-to-person level, which is not necessarily the same in the US.
Wow, see, I didn't know most of that, so that's pretty interesting. I sort of wish my university had something like that.
It's a great structure if you can get in. If you can't get into the co-op program, it is much, much harder, because a lot of local places will just say, "Oh, we'll hire through the co-op program." And so now there's a new gating issue there, which is, can you get into the co-op program? And the co-op program, because it is tied with the academics element, it's going to be much more weighted toward your GPA, your ability to actually sustain your academic activities. If you're someone who's struggling academically, you taking breaks from your academic work to go work in industry, there's concerns that you won't be able to come back and maintain that. And just because it's getting more and more competitive, you will run into that bar just is going to keep getting pushed up and up and up, because it's not, the jobs are not going to scale in the same way, especially when you start looking at more local firms compared to going away. Because if you want to, say you're in Winnipeg and you want to go to Google or Microsoft, you're now having to do a bit more work, because unless Microsoft and Google or Apple, Amazon are coming and actively recruiting on campus, chances are you're going to have to go out, talk with them directly, then see if the company is willing to conform to the constraints, restrictions, and such of the co-op program. So, for example, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon and such normally do a 3-month internship, 12 weeks. Co-op programs, at least at the University of Manitoba when I was there, it was a 4-month, 16-week requirement. And so when I went off to Microsoft, I had to say, hey, I have to be here for 16 weeks. And so thankfully, they were willing to extend my internship longer than everyone else's, because everyone else was there for 12. I got to be there for 16.
Interesting. Huh. Well, I'm glad that you were able to figure that out before they had all those programs established. So that's pretty neat. I think that makes it even more impressive. You're able to go out and figure that out.
Well, I was getting to Microsoft was a bit of a fluke. I think the longer you spend, I was going to say in industry, but I imagine I could just say the longer you spend in life, you start to look back and you start noticing how many things you barely missed. And so the reason I say this with Microsoft was on campus for the first time that I ever knew of. And we were having, it was called, I think it was called the Speed Meet and Greet. It was a tradition with our school or with our department where a bunch of local employers would come and you would do the equivalent of speed dating. They had tables all in a room. They would ring a bell. You would have to move to another table. So there'd be a group of you moves to a table, get to talk with the employer. They would do their normal sales pitch of why we're amazing, why we're exciting, why you should want to come to us, and these are our requirements. And lo and behold, Microsoft was there for the first time. They were the big fish. And so I was going, they're Microsoft. No, not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And why waste my time talking with them if it's not going to happen? So I went to a bunch of the other ones, and we had one more spot. There was one more setting. I had talked with everyone I wanted to talk to, and Microsoft was the next table over. And I'm like, fine, you know what? They rang the bell. I got up. I moved over one table, and I sat down with a gentleman named Jeff. I'm still in contact with Jeff. He's one of the most amazing people I think in the world. And I just had a chat with him, and it was not an impressive chat. I was not trying to sell myself. It was just like, here's my resume. Here's a business card I have. Here's the motions I'm supposed to do with you as we awkwardly talk about, possibilities. And I believe it was, I can't remember if it was that night or the next night, but the next night, though, definitely Microsoft had another presentation where they were doing another sales pitch. Whenever big tech comes to a campus, we're doing sales pitches to students, all the benefits, all the exciting reasons why you should want to work here. I don't think we need to do those anymore. Everyone knows why people might want to come work for us. But they were having one of those pitches. I went, I got the free pizza because that was the other rule in college was anytime there was a big presentation, there was going to be pizza and you were obligated to go get pizza because we are poor. I went, had a chat with Jeff again, and I think it was that night, like the moment I got home, I got a phone call from Jeff, and it was, okay, I need you to open up your computer. We're going to walk you through the filling out the application, and immediately he put me at the head of the queue, and I got to go do probably the best trip I ever did. Got flown out to Seattle, got to do a bunch of interviews on campus, and I remember every single interview.
They were flying students out back then too?
Yep.
Oh, nice.
Yes, it was, and it was flying me out for an internship, which we don't do that at Google. I don't think Amazon did it. I don't think it's that common at all anymore.
Microsoft still does it. Even for their most entry-level internship, they fly you out. They put you in a hotel. You can stay up to a week. They cover all your meals. They give you a stipend to tour Seattle. They really, even if you don't get the offer, you still get to, which I think is Just what a nice way to treat, poor college students who, even if they
It's
don't get the internship, they just had the trip of like a lifetime.
it really is a trip of a lifetime. I know for myself, uh, like I grew up above modest means. I grew up in not a well-off family, but we were always comfortable. But my parents were very frugal, and so this was the first exposure in a way to this is almost a life of luxury. We grew up, if we did road trips growing up, it was staying in a comfort inn or something. And this was, I land in Seattle and I get a driver picks, not a taxi, a driver picks me up in a nice, I think it was a town car, a Lincoln or something, drives me to the Marriott Hotel. Here's a fancy, fancy hotel. And for the first time in my life, I got to order room service. And these all sound like the simplest little things compared to what, the trips I get to do now or now is maybe not the correct term. A year ago, but those little magic moments, and then getting to go onto Microsoft campus for the first time and getting to meet some amazing people who are working in Microsoft game studios. Like I said, I can remember every single interview I had that day. I could probably recount every moment from like that whole trip. Like I will say, it wasn't. The flights are not great. Like flying to and from Winnipeg to Seattle is not great, but everything else about it was great.
Yeah, they I think that's like the first thing I really understood later was that was my first technical interview experience. And then I realized later, oh wait, this isn't normal. Most companies.
Yeah, that's the exception.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a really great way to start. Nice. Okay, so you had all that experience coming out of college, and you got noticed by a Google recruiter, and she said, we want to interview you. And what was your response? Like, how did you prepare for that?
The immediate response was I deleted the email because I thought it was spam.
Okay.
I was actually at my last internship with Microsoft, and I was sitting at my computer, and an email comes in, and it said, I'm so and so from Google. I saw you on LinkedIn. Would love to chat. And I looked at it, and I'm like, well, this was sent to my school email, which is nowhere on my LinkedIn profile. And there was all these little things that just didn't line up. And so I'm like, spam, delete. Went back to work for half an hour, then stopped and was like, went into the trash, brought the email back out, and just sat and stared at it for maybe 5-10 minutes. Like, if it's spam, I still want to follow through on this. So I responded. So my first step, and definitely a piece of advice, don't delete the email that any recruiter sends to you before you explore the opportunity properly. After that, in terms of preparing, I took all the resources the recruiter sent me, and I took them quite seriously. They sent me, a list of like things I might be interested in reading, and I read all of them, and they were all useless. If anything, they scared me more than prepared me.
Yeah.
Like one of them was a design, like a white paper that Google had produced about how it stores data in its data centers. And I'm reading this thinking, oh crap, I'm going to get quizzed on this dense information. I'm reading it the night before, trying to understand it, and nothing is making sense in this paper. And the interview had nothing to do with it. So I have no idea why a recruiter would send that to a candidate. But the phone interview went really well, and I didn't prepare for it. It was one of those things where if you're a college student, chances are you're kind of in the right like condition. In a way, when it comes to interviewing, you can think of it as like training for certain sports. While you're in college, you are continuously doing that training. So once an interview comes up, you are actually conditioned for it quite well. Once you get into industry, those muscles start to fatigue. And so it can act, a lot of the time, students fresh out of college still in college can do a lot better in a lot of interviews than industry experienced engineers who did not take time to retrain some of those muscles to get back into proper interviewing conditions. So the phone interview was pretty simple. It was your basic format of here's a technical question, programming question, write this code. Back then it was in Google Docs, and it still was in Google Docs until quite recently, where we got a new shiny tool to use that is thankfully not Google Docs. But it went well. And the reason you can know it goes well is if you go over the time limit chatting with the interviewer, not doing the question, but chatting, it went well most of the time, or they just liked you. There's definitely been some candidates who have just been great to talk to, but they didn't do too well. But shortly after that, I was told I'll be brought down for full-time interviews, and I try to prepare for those ones. Everyone has heard of cracking the coding interview, so I bought it, I scanned 3 pages of it, and then put it away, and haven't opened it since.
Oh.
I'm not a huge fan of it. It was extremely useful and relevant once upon a time. How we've interviewed, while the structure hasn't tremendously changed, the questions we're asking have changed over time. We tend to ask 1 or 2 larger questions and many smaller questions. And while the principles of what that book covers are important, I don't feel like it's actually the best way to prepare yourself. But it's a way to get an idea of topics that will likely be talked upon. But I will also say, if any company comes to your campus, or you can talk to someone at that company, just ask them how they do their interviews, because every company does them differently. And even bigger tech companies, we all kind of follow a very similar model these days. But as you get more to like the medium or smaller tech companies, they have their own way of doing it because they can't operate in the same way larger companies work at. The larger companies were pretty slow compared to a lot of smaller companies. We have a lot more indirection. For example, with Google, I might conduct the interview, but I don't get to make a decision. There's a committee of other engineers who review what I wrote in terms of how the interview went. Then they make a decision on what happens. So there's a lot of time between those two things. That committee might really only meets once a week. So if they meet on Thursday and I interviewed you on Friday, it's a week before they'll even look at it. And if they decide that, if they're like a hung jury, another interviewer will be called in, and now you might be another 2 weeks away from hearing anything. Small company, one person might chat with you and give the yes or no, and that's it. Of course, the larger companies, we tend to be very careful in terms of we're trying to eliminate bias, we're trying to make sure we're being objective, and that slows us down. Smaller companies, though, they're not going to be as concerned with that. A gut feeling might be enough, which might mean there's a bit more bias in their decisions, but they are going to be a lot quicker about it. And their culture will be very different. So normally, if you're ever talking with a recruiter, if I'm ever talking with a recruiter, the first questions are just, how is your hiring process set up? How do you conduct interviews? Because that is going to be the biggest tell. There are still tech companies, especially smaller ones, they don't ask you technical questions. They just assume you went to school, you have an internship or something, you know what you're doing. There's no reason to test that. If not, we can just teach you that. I don't fully agree with that, but some of them do it that way. So yeah, back to the original question though, in terms of preparing, I didn't prepare a whole lot, mostly because I did a lot of programming competitions in school. So I was already very comfortable with the concept of here's a question you've never seen before, solve it very quickly. You're going to have to make good use of data structures or else it's going to fail. Programming competitions, the biggest issue is you use the wrong data structure, it's going to time out. So very comfortable with trying to figure out the pattern in terms of classify the problem, figure out what data structures are best to use, how to implement them, good to go. So interviewing was not a big thing. That all being said, I thought I failed my Google interview. From talking with a lot of other people who have come to Google and such, often the people who think they failed it did better than they think. The people who think they nailed it did worse than they think. It just seems to be a common way it goes. So yeah, I'm not the best one in terms of follow my example on how to prepare for the interview, because definitely I didn't put the work in.
Well, I think a key thing you said there, though, is that you're already doing stuff in school that help prepare you. A lot of people seem to wait until the last minute to just like cram. And I think that never really works in classes, and that doesn't really work in interviews either if you are doing the slow, long approach. And especially by getting involved in something that's a lot more interesting than just doing hundreds of interview questions, like a club where you're competing. I think that just makes way more sense, and it gives you a lot more to talk about too in your interview when it comes to like outside experience, and say, hey, you know, I was part of this club and here's what we did, and you know, if you placed or something, that's even better.
In terms of what you just said, in terms of cramming, definitely it doesn't work for the same reason as you can't do all your exercising in the week before you're going to go run a marathon. If you haven't been ever done running before, it's just not going to work. It's going to go really badly in many, many, many ways. And it is still, like you said, you can't cram effectively for a test. Like, you know, I can't go write an LSAT with only studying for a week before it, unless I have a history of other things that are ready to go. Yeah, you have to kind of keep yourself in good shape. And this is why being in college, you are in a way in that shape if you're paying attention, you know, in your data structures courses. We always harp about data structures just because they're such a key part of actually how interviewing tends to work out. But the people who do, I think, the best in most interviews are the people who don't have to think about writing the code. That's just muscle memory. They can focus on the problem. They can focus on the high-level elements of it, and they can just express it in code the same as they would just express a sentence in English. It becomes a second language to them, and they no longer have to battle with how to write something in code. The people who struggle the most are the people who are trying to do both at the same time. They're struggling to solve the problem, and they're struggling to express a solution in code. And there's just too much cognitive conflict there to actually make progress. And being comfortable with code comes from writing a lot of code. You don't get enough experience with this in school. Computer science, and specifically computer science, is a science. It's not a trade. You're going to focus on theories. You're going to focus on applying those theories, yes, but areas of study. Writing code is something you have to do kind of on your own. This is one reason why a lot of recruiters will talk about, you know, do you have projects? Do you have practical experience? And one thing I do disagree with a lot of our recruiters is I care that you're doing projects, but I don't care if you finished any of them. I was always doing projects, even since before I graduated from high school. I never finished a single one. They were all not even half finished. It was, I worked on them till I got bored and then I moved on.
Interesting. I've never heard someone say that before, but I think that's actually a decent point, is you don't have to have this perfect, polished end release to the user product. I mean, you're just someone trying to learn.
Well, and releasing it is not necessarily a great thing. Like, so if we look at mobile applications, you release an application, my first question is going to be, great, how many you like, or it might not be my first question, but a normal question is, how many users do you have? How many times have it been downloaded? We're going to go start comparing it to other released apps. It's just what we want to do. It's the most accessible thing to ask about. But the questions really should be, what did you learn from it? What was an interesting component of it? And if you were trying to get a product done, you don't spend much time on those things. When you try to polish something, you are spending a lot of time on a lot of mundane little things that actually have very little to do with software engineering. For example, if you're doing an app, how much time are you fussing with the UI? The answer is a lot. A lot of apps are really just collect data, display data, take input, send it off somewhere, get input or get data back, update the UI. It's not a whole lot in the app. And I think this is where people actually kind of go wrong in terms of they try to make an app and the computer science element, the practical experience in terms of writing code, they don't actually get, because you spend so much time on these other things. And it's not the most effective use of your time. Same with any product or a project you try to take on. Like, of course, I came from computer science in the direction of games. I never finished a single game. I didn't actually want to make a game. I liked making game-related technologies. So I would go look up, watch things from GDC, the Game Developers Conference, look up articles that NVIDIA published about GPU techniques, and I would try and utterly fail to implement them. Because normally they were very interesting, they were state-of-the-art, which is why I failed to implement them. But from that, I got to write a lot of code. It rarely worked. But it also meant when it came to having conversations with people, I had a lot more stories to tell or areas to talk about than someone who spent a really long time polishing one thing. And when you're a student and you're starting out, breadth is your friend. Depth is not going to help you. Mainly just because as you get further on, you're going to look back and you're going to realize how little you really knew back then, and going with depth is not going to be your friend. And in general, your programs at school are focused on breadth. They want you to get a wide kind of look at what there is, so you can get a rough idea of maybe what you want to look into further, what areas you might just want to avoid. I have very little interest in machine learning. I got a glimpse of it in school and I ran the other way. I know that's kind of the opposite of a lot of people want to do today. We have a lot of people who just want to do machine learning. Great, please do it. I don't want to do it. So if you can do it, great, that helps me out. But it's also important from the sense of a large amount of innovation in our industry came from cross applications of things. One of my favorite things or moments is whenever I can say, like, oh, over here they did this, so we could do something similar over here, even if these two things are nothing at all related. It's a really exciting moment when, for example, I was working on a project at Google called Shaka Player. It's an open source video player. Anyone can look it up, meaning everyone can go look up how poorly I implemented this thing, which was we were having issues managing the internal state of the player. The code got a little unwieldy. We needed to add some more features and we just couldn't. The code was it was too hard to work with. And so I was able to borrow ideas from graph theory and, surprisingly enough, how routers communicate to come up with a different way for us to express the internal states of the player and for how it can actually transition between them, allowing us to more modularly build out these parts of the player, thus then making it just easier to work with. So if everyone wants to see how poorly I actually implemented this idea, you're free to go do it. But it was exciting to be able to say, what if we use graph theory and networking to solve a code health problem?
Wow, that's all pretty interesting. You've expressed a lot of like thoughts I haven't heard before that I think are very practical and relevant to students. Well, I think a lot of students hear advice from other students, and they don't ever really get advice from people who have been in the industry for a long time because they don't really know that many professionals at larger companies yet, right? And so it's sort of like this bubble where a lot of our own thoughts are being bounced off the walls and coming back. And so you hear what you think and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. I already sort of thought that same way or same thing. But then like the more I talk to people who have been working for several years already, the more I'm hearing things that I sort of assumed were true. And they're just like, no, that's what I thought when I was your age too. And it's just not. So I think it's really great to get this information out there and get younger people to realize that there's more than one way of approaching interviews and jobs and really just everything. So
the longer you're around, it's almost the harder making any decision gets, just because you get a lot more of the accept moments, even as you're trying to think through a problem. You actually, like, my younger self would be able to write code faster than I can today. Because when I go to try write code today, there's a lot more like, but I have to keep in mind, I should actually do this. It would be a bad idea to do this. If I do it this way in 2 weeks, it's going to bite me. The younger me would just be like a little kid who finally got to drive the car. They're not going to be concerned about hitting the curb or the tree or the squirrel. The adult, the person who's been driving for a while is thinking like, oh, geez, there's a deer that could jump out behind that tree over there. No. So when you're younger, when you're starting out, yes, you can be you're reckless when you're writing code, which is actually not necessarily a bad thing. It actually means you can try out a lot of ideas faster compared to when you get more experience and you actually tend to slow down because you spend more time thinking about it, which actually means you don't get to explore as many ideas.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and allowing me to interview you. I had a few more questions, but because I have to be at work in 15 minutes, I have to cut this a little short. But it was an honor to be able to talk to you and interview you. I learned a lot. I'm sure anyone who listens to this will learn a lot. So thank you so much for sharing your experience and thoughts on here.
Happy to be here.
And where can people find you or any content you have?
I don't have any content, unfortunately. I am on LinkedIn. I don't normally connect with people on LinkedIn unless I've worked with them or have had a significant interaction. I am always willing to answer direct questions. If you have a very specific question, I am happy to answer it. However, please don't ask me what it's like to work at. I get those a lot from people, and they're not questions that are really worth answering.
Yeah. There's plenty of answers already out there on Google. If you're wondering what it's like to work at Google, just Google it. Also, there is a feature on LinkedIn where you can follow someone even if you can't connect with them. So I would encourage people to just go follow you. And I totally understand like not wanting to connect with 100 random strangers who suddenly ask you. Because there's a reason they have a follow versus a connect. So.
Yep. I guess I could also say on GitHub, you can also follow me there. I do contribute to some repositories from time to time, or just put up code samples for things I find interesting. So that might be another place to to follow.
Yeah, for sure. Nice. Well, thank you once again, and I will end this now.